and welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this Exploder, and I'm here with another episode just for you. After a unique episode that we did with Rupert Blackheart, Michael McCormick, and Dusty Dillinger, again, thank you to those three for coming on the show and listening to myself and answering some questions. I really appreciate that. I'm back to the traditional format, and I wanted to talk about a topic that's really been on my mind lately. I've done a lot of research on, and I just thought it was very interesting. A while ago, I did an episode on the year 2000. About how it was a pivotal year for professional wrestling, and how everyone looks at 2001 as the end of the Attitude Era and the end of the Monday Night Wars, but they don't really think about 2000 being the big diversion point, if you will. Well, in this episode, I want to talk about the other end of things. I want to talk about a year that wasn't necessarily the best for anyone, but had some bright spots along the way. I'm talking about 1995 in professional wrestling. I want to start out by talking about the elephant in the room. Yes, 1995 was probably the worst year for the WWF financially. It has the lowest drawing champions, that being Bret Hart, Diesel, and many things have been said about drawing, and I have my opinions on who draws and what drawing is and all these things. But again, I'm just a fan. I'm sure there's someone who's in the business like Eric Bischoff or Bruce Pritchard or whoever would be there to tell me that I'm full of crap. Don't know, don't care. TV ratings were actually slightly up at this time, but live attendance was beginning to falter. Now, according to Bruce Pritchard, this was part of a general trend where live event companies like Professional Sports, Ringling Brothers Circus, remember that used to be a thing, and etc., were also experiencing lower attendance. To combat this, lower end ticket prices went down, but higher end tickets remained basically the same, again, according to Bruce Pritchard. Shawn Michaels would start the year by winning the Royal Rumble from the #1 position, the first to ever do this. It's kind of a little asterisk next to that, considering that, as we all know, the Royal Rumble is sort of determined what they call Titan time. The intervals between wrestlers is sort of determined by, it's supposed to be 60 seconds or 90 seconds, but really it's whenever they say. In this case, Shawn Michaels coming for the #1 position as a heel, which was very unique. Davey Boy Smith was #2. He only went 38 minutes to win the Rumble. Now, there have been people in the past who went way longer and didn't win. And you have Shawn Michaels here going and winning the thing from #1, but it's only 38 minutes because of the 60 seconds between competitors. Also, in addition to the Big Five being the Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, King of the Ring, SummerSlam, and Survivor Series, the WWF would also introduce the In Your House concept. This would be cheaper 2-hour pay-per-views that would act as basically B shows in between those big five that I mentioned. The first one would cost $15, and by the end of the year, they would go up to $20. What was significant about the first one was, in the first one, they gave away a house in Florida to some kid who immediately flipped it for a profit because he didn't live in Florida. This would begin a larger trend in the wrestling industry where it upped the pay-per-view to every month. After WCW had upped it up to 9 that year, and the WWF said, screw it, let's just do it every month. WCW, of course, then responded and put theirs to month. So during the prime from 1995 until early 2001, there were a pay-per-view from WCW every month and a pay-per-view from the WWF every month. And ECW was still doing quarterly because that's all they could really afford. So in certain months, every 3 months or so, you would have 3 pay-per-views, 3 wrestling pay-per-views on Sundays. So that was really unique. It began here in 1995 with the introduction of the In Your House. Speaking of bad decisions, not saying that, I don't know, maybe that's a bad decision, however you want to look at it, because the WWF later would go on and try 12, 13, 14, 15 pay-per-views a year, and that was insane. But on the definitely bad idea, Lawrence Taylor, remember him from the New York Giants? Yes, he retired from the NFL and then decided to try wrestling. He and Bam Bam Bigelow would headline WrestleMania 11. Bigelow's a great big man, and I'm not going to discourage anybody. If you ever want to go back and see a big guy who can work, who can move, who can put guys over, who has a great, and really if you ever hear him talk, do the old interviews, a great psychology of the business, I love him. I actually do love him. I think he's a very talented guy, and I think he did a great role. He was great in the role that he was in. They needed a big guy for a guy to work with Lawrence Taylor. Lawrence Taylor just retired from the NFL. He, let's call it what it was, had a cocaine problem. I'm just going to say it the way it is. He's renowned for his run-ins with the law and so on and so forth, and I'm not going to harp on those, but he did. Lawrence Taylor would debut at WrestleMania 11 in a match with Bam Bam Bigelow, which he would win, despite the fact that he was blown out, 2 minutes in, and this would be his first and last match in wrestling. So we saw how that went. It was a big deal. I remember the WWF made a big deal out of this. They sold LT shirts. They brought in this guy to do, they sold, I can't remember how many things they sold that had Lawrence Taylor. They sold a shirt that had Lawrence Taylor's picture on it. It was just Lawrence Taylor, and he's got the earring in his ear. And again, if you're watching the video version, I'm going to find a picture of this shirt, because I vividly remember this shirt, because I started watching wrestling in like 92. And I cannot believe, for a WrestleMania that didn't do that well, that was in an arena that was basically part of a strip mall, like the Hartford Civic Center, I cannot remember all the promotion, all the bullcrap they put into. Nicholas Turturro was there. Jonathan Taylor Thomas was there at the height of the home improvement thing. You know, all these big... Salt and Peppa played Lawrence Taylor to the ring to What a Man, and all these things. So they were trying their best to make this big Hollywood thing about WrestleMania. Lawrence Taylor was not a great worker, but he wasn't expected to be, and for what it was, I'm sure it did okay. I'm sure Lawrence Taylor loved the money he got. But the fallout, of course, it wasn't a great WrestleMania in general. I mean, Shawn Michaels and Diesel was a semi-main event for the world title, and it was probably the worst Shawn Michaels Diesel match ever. And I think even, I don't know about Shawn, but I'm pretty sure Diesel would even admit that. Shawn Michaels took a horrible powerbomb. I don't know what the hell that was about. And they introduced Pamela Anderson and Jenny Garth and Sid and all these different things, these bells and whistles, but the match itself just wasn't that good. Bigelow would eventually turn face and work alongside Diesel against former $1 Million Corporation members Sid, Tatanka, and so on and so forth. But he would eventually slide back down the card before negotiating his release from the WWF. His last appearance would be at 1995 Survivor Series, losing to someone who'd recently debuted, Goldust, who I promise you I will get into. Mabel from Men on a Mission turned heel because why not? Of course, this was without Oscar, and Mabel and Mo would go into the King of the Ring 1995. Mabel would win the King of the Ring, and which makes total sense if you think about the legacy. Bret Hart, Owen Hart, Mabel makes total sense. Combine that with the classics he would have with Savio Vega in the King of the Ring finals, his match with The Undertaker, also at King of the Ring. I mean, really, let's call it, if The Undertaker can't pull you through a good match, you need to consider a new career. I'm just going to say it. And hey, Nelson Frazier did a lot for himself. For a guy his size, he did really well, and he kept working, and good for him. But at this point, he was known more for being a big guy who hurt guys than he was known for anything else. Not only that, but King Mabel would also face off against Yokozuna at WrestleMania 4, and then the end of this push, thank God, he would face off against WWF champion Diesel at SummerSlam 1995. And yes, that match was as bad as you think it is. Go watch it. Holy crap. Of course, another legend would debut in 1995 as the wrestling magician slash mime from hell Fantasio would debut on July 16th. He disappeared just as quickly, presumably in a puff of smoke. There's really nothing else to say to that. He did magic tricks in the ring, took a guy's underwear, and he got sent back to Memphis faster than you could finish saying his name. Although another debut that would actually change things for the better, October 22nd, 1995, Goldust would debut at In Your House 4, defeating Marty Jannetty. This character would prove to be more mature, and some would argue, although not officially, some would argue this was the first inkling of the step toward the Attitude Era. Of course, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart and all these things that would happen along the way. But really, if you look at it, in October of 1995, Goldust was like nothing else. And he was a character that was just that little twinge of it. And they would do that in January when he would go into the feud with Razor Ramon. And there was some I don't know how to say it, homosexual tones there. And it was meant to sort of induce maybe a gay panic concept. Not necessarily the greatest idea, but it was controversial and it was pushing that way. And this character started on October 22nd, 1995. October 23rd, 1995, another one on an episode of Raw, Ahmed Johnson would make his TV debut, and then at Survivor Series 1995, he would join the weird team of Shawn Michaels, who is now a babyface, the British Bulldog, and Psycho Sid to defeat Yokozuna, Owen Hart, the babyface Razor Ramon, and the heel Dean Douglas in a traditional 4-on-4 Survivor Series match, with Michaels, Bulldog, and Johnson being the sole survivors. Now, and not only that, but Johnson, the newly debuted Johnson, would get 2 of the eliminations. There's only 4 men on the team, and he would eliminate 2 of them. That's not a bad way to start your career. Of course, he'd become the marble-mouthed monster that you would see later on, but again, for a guy who's just starting out, not that bad. 1995 for the WWF was not a transitional moment. It was still going the trend. The trend in 1993 wasn't good. The trend in 94 was worse. The trend in 95 was even worse. 1996, I hate to say, was keep going that direction. It wasn't great. And it wasn't going to be until late 97 before the company would turn around. So 1995 for the WWF was not great. There were some good matches along the way, and I'll try and post some of those good matches, or at least references to those good matches because I know the WWF is waiting to take down any video that mentions them, any kind of clip, any kind of anything, because that's how they work. Literally, I'm going to put in a little side here. The first episode I did of this show was about the Royal Rumble a couple years ago, and I showed in the video a 3-second clip of Lita doing a moonsault. That's what it was. I think, yeah, it was a Royal Rumble. It was a Royal Rumble. It was a 3-second clip, and the WWF, their legal department or whatever, the algorithm, Jerry McDevitt's Schnauzer, I don't know who the hell's running this, but they cut the video. They put a copyright claim because I showed a 3-second clip. I'm not lying. So in this case, I'm going to reference them, but I'm not going to post them directly for obvious reasons. So let's go down to Georgia with WCW in the year 1995. Now, WCW wasn't doing much better in 1995. Now, they had picked up Hulk Hogan in 1994, which was obviously good. It added to pay-per-view buys. It added a little bit to ratings. Now, keep in mind, for all of 94 and most of 95, their main show was still WCW Saturday Night, which itself, being at 6:05 on a Saturday night, was not going to draw main event numbers. It was not going to draw what Raw drew on Monday, because that's just not how it works. I watched it, many people did, but it wasn't the same as going on Monday night, which would change, and I will tell you about that. WCW house shows, live shows again, were barely drawn 3,000 people. I mean, so Bischoff, logically, who'd come in, decides, hey, let's have less house shows, because every time they left, they were losing money on house shows. So why continue to do more of the thing that's costing you money? Which makes sense. Now, this would, as a result, lead to a lighter schedule. Now, combine this with the existing culture of guaranteed contracts, which Bischoff did not create, he simply walked into, admittedly, because these contracts existed well in the Bill Watts era. Before the Bill Watts era, they were guaranteed contracts. So Bischoff didn't create them, but when Bischoff had this existing culture and then lowered the number of dates, so you make guaranteed money, more money, because you still had the Turner background, and now you have a lighter schedule, this would create it would create a different culture, and it was in a way indirectly pave the way for some of the guys who would come in, being Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and the like in 1996. But we're not there yet. At Uncensored 1995, Dustin Rhodes and Barry Darsow, gimmick number 5, Blacktop Bully, would face off in a pre-taped King of the Road match on a moving tractor trailer. The goal, as if it matters, was to make your way to the front and blow the horn, because that's how you establish road dominance. Duh. Despite getting permission ahead of time by the agent Mike Graham, and it was being pre-taped, Rhodes, Darsow, and Graham would be fired for bleeding during the match, which was against Turner policies at the time. Now, never mind that Hogan had done this at a non-televised event prior, but you're not going to fire Hulk Hogan, are you? No. Keep in mind, it was pre-taped, and they still aired it on pay-per-view, but then again, it was still WCW. Darsow and Graham would eventually be rehired by the company, but Rhodes would go on to, like I said, later that year become Goldust. So it worked out for him in the end. Dustin would eventually come back later on, and so on and so forth. And I covered that. If you want a great episode to look at, it's called From Dust to Gold. I'll put up a thing on there, and if nothing else, I'll put a link to it. That's when I cover the entire career of Dustin Rhodes, and it's really interesting from this incident to the start of Goldust to the end of Goldust, and so on and so forth. It's a really great episode. Go check that out. 1995, shameless plug. 1995 also introduced another thing, the Dungeon of Doom concept. Now, when Hulk Hogan first came in, the first thing they did was put him against Ric Flair, which made total sense. They would have the first match at Bash of the Beach in 94. They'd have the second match at Halloween Havoc in 94. Hogan would win both matches. Then they started this thing where Ric Flair's not enough. So then they brought in Kevin Sullivan, who was, at the time, the booker. And Kevin Sullivan created a thing called they were the Three Faces of Fear, which was him, they turned Brutus Beefcake, and the Avalanche, which was John Tenta, Earthquake, Shark, whatever you want to call him. And then that morphed over time into a thing called the Dungeon of Doom. Now, the Dungeon of Doom was explicitly created to create monsters for Hulk Hogan to overcome. It's a method, it worked all through the 80s, say what you want. Hogan wins the title in 84, and then it was just, okay, Big John Studd, okay, King Kong Bundy, okay, Roddy Piper, okay, One Man Gang, Big Boss Man, Zeus, Randy Savage. It was just create a monster, put him against Hogan, Hogan beat down, overcomes, wins, goes to the next one. This was that only very explicitly. It was a faction of ridiculous characters created solely to be fed to Hulk Hogan, whether it's Avalanche, who was renamed to the Shark. Big Boss Man, who could obviously not be called Big Boss Man, became Big Bubba. Z Gangsta, which again would not be introduced in 95, but introduced in 96. They brought in One Man Gang, they brought in Kamala, all these different characters. The problem with this was it led to a decline. It was basically the last full year you were going to see the Hulk Hogan formula work. People by this point were basically tired of the Hulk Hogan gimmick. Now, I don't know what the numbers look like, and I'm not going to sit here and quote, Nielsen's till the end of time, but I do know that it was declining. They were going downhill. The Dungeon of Doom was not a great idea. I remember, like I said, I've said this before, but I remember one time where it's Sting, Randy Savage, and Hogan, I think, and they teleported to a literal dungeon. They teleported, like the Power Rangers, whatever. I explicitly remember that, but it's insane. But anyway, what this did was, this sort of, the act was, it was running out. They were dealing with Hulk Hogan overcoming the monsters. The problem was they couldn't create the monsters fast enough, and the crowd was turning. The crowd was changing, and they didn't care about the Monster of the Week formula anymore. Now add to that the decline of guys like Vader, who was a main event act. He was buried really quickly with Hogan. Vader was a main guy. People don't understand it. If you only saw Vader in the WWF in the late 90s, you don't understand the kind of monster he was. When he came from Japan, when he came in, they put him over like $1,000,000. He was a giant man who took on Sting, and he took on Ric Flair. And I'll still put out, and again, this isn't 1995, but I'll tell you right now, 1993 Starrcade, Vader, Ric Flair. Look at that match. It was probably the first match I remember from WCW. That was that first. Look at that match and tell me Vader was not the biggest monster heel you've ever seen in your life. That's what made him so great. By 95, Hogan was looking for monsters to destroy, and unfortunately Vader became one. And that, of course, was the one where Vader, at the time, was known for his Vader Bomb. The Vader Bomb at the time was a power bomb. And Vader power bombed Hogan, and Hogan popped right back up and killed him right there. Hogan won the entire feud, and Vader was never the same after that. I mean, even as a career, he was never the same after that. He would then eventually get into a fight with Agent Paul Orndorff and go to the WWF in 1996, debuting of all things in January of 96. And that's a whole different can of worms. Like I said, this would continue the trend of focusing on Hogan, Randy Savage, Lex Luger, all of which were, as far as fans were concerned, WWF talent who are now in WCW. Luger had been WCW before, but people knew Luger at that point coming from the WWF, and they were getting more focus, where guys like Ric Flair, Sting, and Vader were kind of pushed to the side. And I think Sting would get his time, Luger would get his time, but Flair, even at this time, after the initial run with Hogan, Flair would sort of be pushed to the side. He'd be given the Horsemen, Anderson and Benoit and Pillman and Mike Michael and all these things, but he was never that top guy ever again. It was the Hogan show. Even the age of the NWO, you had guys like Ric Flair fighting for the U.S. title, and that was sort of something that began in 1995. The focus was on Hogan and his friends and his WWF compatriots, and WCW locals and compatriots were sort of pushed to the side in a way. WCW and New Japan would have a show in North Korea on April 28th and 29th in 1995. This is, of course, run by Kim Jong-il at the time. North Korea is I'll say it right now, a hellhole. I don't think I have many fans in North Korea. And this show was huge, and to this day is the largest number of fans at a single pro wrestling event. Now, of course, it's hard to measure those numbers and how many actually had a gun in their backs, but the point remains, it was a huge event. Muhammad Ali was there. It was a big thing. And that happened, of course, in April of 1995, so that's significant. Another significant thing that would happen in 1995 would be people like Steve Austin and Jean-Paul Levesque, who would also later be known as Triple H, would both be fired from WCW. Now, Austin had been there quite a while. He messed up his shoulder, I think it was, and he was in Japan and doing promotional work and things like that, and he was fired, I believe, famously by FedEx, and that'll come in later in this story. Triple H, Levesque, whatever you want to call him, actually had a pay-per-view match and was doing well. It was teaming with Steven Regal, and his deal had come up, and he wanted to go to the WWF, and WWF wanted him, and it worked out that way. So it was more amicable, but again, these are two guys who would later become major talents, both being fired from WCW in a way in 1995. And of course, in 1995, you can't talk about it without talking about the debut of Monday Nitro, which would also start the Monday Night Wars. Of course, the first episode would begin with Lex Luger, who had just come for the WWF literally the night before, because he'd working without a deal. And later on, I believe in December, you'd have the debut of Medusa, who would come back and drop the women's title into the trash, the WWF women's title into the trash, which was a huge shot against the bow. Like, not the WWF gave a crap about the women's championship, because if they did, they wouldn't have just not had a division and then released the champion while she still held the belt. Details. But the fact that they did it so openly led to the Monday Night Wars that we know and love, and they would not be interesting in late September, not late '95. They debut in September on a night where Raw was preempted by a dog show, because that's something that used to happen all the time. And they would trade victories back and forth, but at the time, WWF programming was not that great, and WCW programming was not that great. So at that time, it was like, what can of dog food do you want? Really, it was, I hate to say it, but that's what it was at the time. In late 95, it wasn't a lot of great wrestling. It wasn't a lot of great either from either side. Just, do you want to see Hogan defeat the Monster of the Week? Or do you want to see Diesel maybe do 6 moves? It wasn't great. The Raw at the time was more jobber matches. It was their main show, but it was jobber matches. Nitro was more star versus star, but a lot of times it was either the same people versus the same people, or it was matches that didn't really mean anything in the long term. And of course, the obligatory Hogan segments, so on and so forth. And yeah, that's what I'm saying. So that's the thing. That was the beginning of Nitro, beginning of the Monday Night Wars, and it all started in September of 1995. Now, let's go a little bit north again. Let's go to ECW. ECW, when people think about the Monday Night Wars, when people talk about 1995, they think about either A, the beginning of Nitro, or B, how awful the WWF was at the time. What they're not thinking about is how ECW was beginning to improve. Now, I'm not here to judge 1994, and I'm not, I'm going back through and I'm watching some old episodes, and I'm not going to say 1994 was bad. 1994 was a transitional period for ECW. They switched from Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling. They put the emphasis on Shane Douglas as their franchise. They went to the extreme parts of things, bringing in guys like, the Public Enemy were getting over, and all these things. January of 1995 saw the debut of Raven. Now, this is significant for the company because this would also kick off the Raven-Tommy Dreamer feud. And if you ever watched ECW programming, the one thing you'll notice is that Raven was a mainstay of their programming for over 2.5 years. Starting in January of 1995, just coming off the Gianni Polo gimmick from the WWF, where he's producing the B shows, he's announcing on Raw, he was a spoiled rich kid manager, and for him to debut in January of 1995 for ECW as Raven, it was completely different. He would become this character from ECW, and he would be a main focus of the company for the next 2.5 years. Raven would feud with Tommy Dreamer. He'd feud with the Sandman. He'd be involved with Cactus Jack, the Bruise Brothers, Terry Funk, Shane Douglas. All these people that you think all revolve around this Raven character, it's really significant when you think about it that he started in early 1995. This would also be the time of the introduction of the original Triple Threat, which of course was Shane Douglas, Chris Benoit, and Dean Malenko. Another thing, now in the grand scope of wrestling, the Triple Threat could be overlooked. You could think of the Horsemen, you could think of the NWO, you could think of D-Generation X as the 3 top factions of all time. Many people aren't going to say the Triple Threat, but for ECW, the Triple Threat was a huge deal, and there were different incarnations, but this incarnation with Douglas, Benoit, and Malenko would play a major role in the company for the following year. Of course, Benoit and Malenko would eventually leave, but at this time, they would become a huge deal for the company. Also, like I mentioned before, Steve Austin would debut in ECW after getting fired from WCW. He was injured. Paul Heyman, who had known him from WCW, who had managed him in the Dangerous Alliance, said, "Hey, come on up, and we'll just let you do promos." And this was the time where, and I'm not going to sit here and say I'm controversial for this, of course this is well known, but this is the time where Steve Austin came into his own, and he was able to do promos. He wasn't Stunning Steve anymore. He could be Steve Austin, and he could be pissed off and a little bitter, and do a work shoot or a shoot. It doesn't matter. He could do whatever he wanted. And he started doing some really humorous stuff. The Steve-A-Mania promo, which was really funny. And then when he got serious, and you saw something. Now, of course, this was the thing where the WWF would see this and go, hey, let's make him the ringmaster. So not everything translates up north like you might think, but it was at least a foot in the door, which was great. Shane Douglas, who was the franchise, who the company was being built out of, Douglas would leave for the WWF to take the Dean Douglas character, which was always going to be a winner, and debut on Superstars on July 29th. He would have a tumultuous run with the WWF, lasting only through the end of the year before returning to ECW in early 96. When he returned in 96, he would be there for another 3 years. So I think that when he left and he came back, he's like, I'm not messing around. And again, when he left in 99, he only left because he was owed a bunch of money because it was still ECW. 1995 was also the mythic Summer of Violence, which saw 2 major feuds dominate that summer. Brian Lee and Tommy Dreamer were in a endless contest to see how many tables Tommy Dreamer could go through without dying. The answer is a lot. And Axel and Ian Rotten, who were the bad breed, who would split up during a match with the Pitbulls, would spend their summer finding new and exciting ways to forcibly donate blood. Oh my god, watch some of their matches. Just the glass and glue, gluing glass to their fists and punching each other. Real glass, real glue, real blood. Holy shit. Now this would have helped establish their reputation of blood and guts that many people would dismissively use to talk down about ECW. Whenever you hear about ECW, people go, oh, the blood and guts, oh, the tables, oh, the cheese graters. And they're not wrong, but this was really the beginning. This was really one of those first few feuds that just people saw. I mean, even in the intro, you saw Tommy Dreamer. Brian Lee chokeslammed Tommy Dreamer off the Eagle's Nest through, I believe, 3 tables. And of course, Tommy Dreamer would later, in high incident, knock him off of scaffolding, and I think Brian Lee would go through 4 tables, maybe 3 or 4. He went at an angle, so he may have clipped a few on the way down. But yeah, when people talk about blood and guts, this is part of what they're referencing. They're not wrong, but they're also not getting the full picture. The full picture, was 1995, was also the year they would introduce and feature guys like Too Cold Scorpio, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, and a debuting Al Snow, who were great technical wrestlers, the guys who didn't need the blood and gut stuff and didn't use it. Also, you had guys, luchadors, they introduced luchadors like Rey Mysterio Jr., Juventud Guerrera, and Psychosis, would all debut in 1995. Now, look at those names. Everyone I just mentioned would be in WCW or the WWF within the year. By 1996, they would all be gone. But, you know, when people talk about, oh, blood and guts, they talk about the Summer of Violence, which was admittedly violent, but look at the names I just mentioned that were not that. The Benoits, the Scorpios, the Malenkos, Guerrero, Al Snow, the Luchadors, some of which are still wrestling today. They weren't that. They were not, I mean, the classics between Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero. Chris Benoit getting his, I mean, the things that Chris Benoit was able to do. Too Cold Scorpio, for him to fly, for him to do the moves he did at his size was insane. So, you know, the full picture of ECW was actually pretty full and unique. And it was luchadors, and it was technical wrestlers, and it was blood and guts. But it was not one or the other. It was a little bit of everything, and it was a hybrid, which was very unique and something that people don't quite understand. And in 1995, you saw it all on display. This was also the prime time for the Public Enemy, as they were all over ECW television. Like I said, right now I'm watching. Part of what inspired this was I've been watching ECW television, hardcore TV from 1995, started in January 1995, and I'm working my way through. And I think I'm in like March by now. But already you're seeing a lot of Public Enemy. Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge are all over TV. They're doing promos. They're doing, they're doing these promos and they're doing all this stuff. They've had these matches where they're just losing their minds. And when they're talking about they're in Florida, I mentioned this on Facebook one time. They're in Florida and they're in a match and someone passes, I believe, Johnny Grunge a snow shovel. Now, why you have a snow shovel in Florida, I'll never know. He proceeded to use it. So I just saw him use a snow shovel in Florida on an opponent because why not? This would, of course, lead them to getting a tryout match with WWF on November 19th, 1995, and they would receive an offer. But Rock and Grunge would choose to go to WCW instead, and they would start with that company in 1996. So again, even in late 1995, you're seeing ECW guys get offers from WWF. 1995 was the year where you were featuring guys, like I said, everyone I just mentioned, from the Public Enemy to Eddie Guerrero to Too Cold Scorpio to Shane Douglas. All the people I just mentioned were going to work for the WWF or WCW by the beginning of the next year. I believe Rey Mysterio came in like March. Rey Mysterio, Psychosis, Juventud Guerrera, guys like that, I think started in March of 96. But 1995 was the last year you were going to see all those guys, and then people are going to start making their way to the big time, as it were. Moving away from ECW and talking about the independent scene, Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling would fold in December of 1995 after 4 years in business. The last show would feature the entire Smoky Mountain Wrestling roster beat up on Jim Cornette before he'd be pinned by referee Mark Curtis. Many talents, including Cornette, Tracy Smothers, the Heavenly Bodies, the Dirty White Boy Tony Anthony, and Boo Bradley, would end up working full-time for the WWF. Tony Anthony would become the wrestling plumber T.L. Hopper, and Bradley would become Santa's evil twin, Santa Claus. Kind of hard to see who was the bigger loser there, but yeah. Here's a fun fact. After Smoky Mountain Wrestling closed, Brad Armstrong, of all people, declared himself the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Heavyweight Champion and defended the title in the USWA. He eventually lost the Zombie title to Jerry Lawler because at some point, everyone had to lose to the King. I'm pretty sure the last 3 mayors have an 0-0 record with him. 1995 was also a very unique year because it was the beginning of All Pro Wrestling in Hayward, California. Now, that's the promotion that was run by Roland Alexander that was featured on Beyond the Mat. The guy with the mustache looked like let me explain. He looked like if Ron Jeremy did your taxes. You know, like that's how I explain it to you. It began in 1985. I guess the promotion in some regard existed back in 1991, but All Pro Wrestling started in 1995 and would run for many, many years after that. It would also feature the debut. The 1995 would feature the debut of guys like Christian Cage, the Giant, who would debut in his first match against Hulk Hogan and win the world title after a giant mummy came in and did horrible things to Hogan's rear end. I wish I was making that up. Speaking of rear ends, DDT hit Senshiro Takagi. Yes, I've talked about DDT before at their Iron Man Championship. The leader's named Senshiro Takagi. He debuted in 1995. High Voltage team members Robbie Rage and Kenny Chaos. Remember them? No, you don't. China. Wow. The guy who would become Abyss debuted as Prince Justice. Adam Rose. I didn't know he went that far back. Former FWA promoter Alex Shane. If you know English wrestling, you'll know FWA. Bull Buchanan, Eddie Umaga Fatu, Jobber, and somehow Pimp Hardbody Harrison would debut in 1995. What a great day for the wrestling business. Jamie Noble, Lenny Lane, Pero Aguayo Jr. Wow, that's significant. Horrible gimmick and worst wrestler Pogo the Clown. Again, not everybody's a winner. Reckless Youth, Shannon Moore, Sherman Tank, Teddy Hart, Trent Acid, Tiger Mask 4, and Tyson Kidd would all debut in 1995. That's actually, it's a mixed bag, but there's some actually really talented people in that list. Well, that's really interesting. Interestingly enough, 1995 would also see the birth of Patrick Clark, the man who would later become the Velveteen Dream. So any of you listening right now who remember 1995, you now feel old, as do I. It would also be the year that many talents of yesteryear would retire, including Laura Alfred Hayes, Animal Hamaguchi, Baron Von Raschke, Dan Spivey, who was doing the Waylon Mercy gimmicks, whom some people believe was the inspiration for the later Bray Wyatt character. He messed up his back. He was still doing the character, and he messed up his back and ended up retiring altogether. Wrestling announcing legend Gordon Soley, Canadian promoter and WWF presidential puppet Jack Tunney, Kevin Von Erich, Pistol Pez Watley, and everyone's favorite Hawaiian shirted manager Captain Lou Albano would all retire in 1995. Albano, I remember coming off the Headstringers gimmick. He managed the Headstringers in 1994, and he finally, I guess, officially retired in 1995. Unfortunately, this would also be the year that would mark the death of Crusher Jerry Blackwell, women's wrestler Black Venus, wrestler and booker Eddie Gilbert, Big John Studd, Killer Carl Krupp, and little person wrestler Little Beaver. So overall, what was 1995 like? Now, I would be remiss if I talked about 1995 being a terrible year. Oh, it was so terrible. And I'm not going to sit here and talk about all the negatives. Well, I kind of did. But there were negatives. Every year has a negative. If I do 1996, you'll see negatives. If I do 1997, you'll see negatives. Wrestling is never 100% great. There are years that are better than others. There are years that are worse than others. 1995 was not a great year for anybody. Overall, the WWF was sort of on decline. 1995 was their worst year financially, and it showed. They were putting guys like Mabel in the top, were trying to put him in a top spot. They would put Diesel as champion, even though people were wanting guys like Bret Hart and later Shawn Michaels in that spot. Nitro started in September, but before this, they were still in the middle of this Hulk Hogan Monster of the Week system. And guys like Vader and Ric Flair and Sting were sort of being pushed to the side in favor of whoever the former WWF cast-offs they could hire next week. The idea of the Dungeon of Doom was not necessarily a terrible idea, but if it worked, it'd been one thing. It was something that didn't work, and they did it for over a year. And it would lead to the decline of Hulk Hogan and the star power of Hulk Hogan, which would eventually lead to the NWO as something they needed to do. Had Hulk Hogan not turned on and joined the NWO in July of 1996, I don't know how WCW would have done, honestly. And 1995 was that year that you saw that decline. You saw that the Hogan Monster of the Week, okay, who's the next big guy to go against, had played itself out because they had been doing it at that point for 11 years. On the other end, you also saw there were some great matches, and I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to link to those. I'm going to put some of those up. I don't have the top of my head, but there's some great matches. I mean, like I said, Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko had some great matches. And overall, there were some great matches along the way. And also ECW. ECW was smaller, and I know some people like Eric Bischoff will dismiss ECW. Oh, they weren't big time. They never drew the numbers that WCW drew. Yeah. But ECW was also improving at that time. They were building stars, and they were building them better than, quite frankly, than WCW was. And better than WF was. I mean, while the WF was giving us Make a Difference Fatu, ECW was building a roster full of talents that were going to make a big name for themselves elsewhere, but did very well for the company at the time. Guys like Shane Douglas and Raven. I mean, the Raven character itself produced guys like, it created these opportunities for guys like Cactus Jack and the Pitbulls and the Bruise Brothers and Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie and Nova. I mean, how many people came from this centralized character? They were building a roster that eventually would make a lot more money elsewhere, but they were improving their product. The Summer of Violence was a thing, but they were also putting together the best technical wrestling you were going to find at the time. They introduced luchadors for the first time since When Worlds Collide in 1993. You were looking at a promotion that was building. It was a promotion that would build inevitably to 1997 when they would debut on pay-per-view, and that unfortunately would lead to their eventual decline by 1999 when they got onto national television, which should have been great for them but wasn't for obvious reasons. WCW would improve in 1996, WWF would improve in late 97, but 1995 again, it's very much like 2000, only reversed. It's a year that there was a watershed moment. 1995 was not great for anybody, but it sort of told you where everyone was going. The WWF would take another year. 1996 was not a great year for the WWF, but it was leading into 1996, literally, but also psychologically. Because the WWF at that time, for whatever reason, thought they could still go the way they were. They thought they could still do the characters. They thought the Boyhood Dream angle was going to go the way they wanted it to, so they started building toward Shawn Michaels. They were building toward Diesel sticking around, and Diesel and Razor Ramon would leave. The WCW were still leaning on Hogan, and they went into 96 with the infamous Doomsday Cage match, which was really the last explosion. That was it. That was the last time where they stopped buying the Hogan thing, because they threw everything but the kitchen sink at them, and then when it was over, they weren't happy. 1996, ECW lost a lot of talent. The independents were there, but in all honesty, the independents in 1996 weren't doing that well either. 1995 was bad for everybody. Promotions were going out of business. Independents weren't drawing a lot of fans. ECW was working, but they were still running at a loss. WCW was relying on Hogan too much, and the WWF was doing more of the same and not really getting anywhere to show for it. So what is 1995? 1995, like I said, is a watershed moment. It's that year where you see where things were going, you saw why they went that way. It's not a great year, but it's not a great year overall, but it's the kind of year that needed to happen for the next step to happen, if that makes any sense. 2000 was the best year for the WWF ever at that point. Financially, they were doing great, and the divide between them and WCW was even better. At this time, 1995 was sort of the opposite. The WWF was really low. They were having a lot of trouble. WCW was still getting their footing, and they had just started Nitro, and they were trying to create conflict and create a war with someone that prior they never even thought they had a chance at. ECW was trying to establish themselves, so this is the year that if you look at it, you see why. You see why these things happened. So that's why I want to do this episode. That's why I wanted to talk about 1995, because I think it's very interesting in that way. It's interesting in sort of the opposite reason why 2000 was interesting. Because while in 2000 you're seeing the end of a war, you were seeing two companies falter and one company thrive, in 1995 you're seeing all three sort of come into their own and work through their own struggles and their own problems. And it's interesting to see where it's going to go in the future. Now, in the future, on this show, I might do a 1996. I'm not going to do it the next show. The next show is going to be something completely different. I don't want to do like a sequential thing. I might do 96 at some point. I might do 97. I mean, there's some really significant years, but that's 1995 was on my head. If you missed it, I'm going to start doing the shameless plug, so you can shut off now if you want to. But if you missed it, ZTO, Legacy Arts, and Beans on Parade, who are three groups I am involved in, and I do stuff not wrestling related, but comedy related. We did a telethon for Halloween. We did that with ZTO and put out a live stream, and we're going to start piecing things out. So you're going to see sketches written by me, musical performances by some of the Dead Dogs, and some really other talented people through Legacy Arts and Russ Gaze Records. And so check that out. If you go ZTO, go to Legacy Arts, go to Beans on Parade, you're going to see a lot of these clips. We're looking at doing some new stuff. Like I said, we have a long-term project we're working on. I'm not going to announce it till it's ready to go, but it's going to be very interesting. Check out Something with Sports. That's Jake Eilerman's podcast. He's doing a great job there about sports. Check out Hillbilly Therapy. I don't know which order you listen to things, but Hillbilly Therapy is coming back. It's going to be a sporadic thing because he's over here and I'm over here. I'm doing this, he's doing another show, and all these things. We both got families, we both got kids, and things like that. But that's something where we have a special episode that's coming out. I hope you check that out. Again, I don't know if you listen to this first or that first, whatever, but check it out. It's actually a really fun show. I'm trying to think of anything else. I don't think there's anything, though. Check out Grow Me CDs and Tapes. If you're in the Lima area, go to Grow Me CDs and Tapes. Support local. I know we're in the middle of a virus, and it's hard to get out to stores and all these things. Be careful, be safe, enjoy your holidays, be safe. But if you can, check out things like Art Space Lima, check out Grow Me CDs and Tapes, which is a great store, and just be supportive, be safe, and be careful with each other, and like I said, not to get all sappy, but we're going to get through this together. So, with all those shameless plugs out of the way, until next time, my name's Dan, this Exploder, have a good one.